Measuring utilization of herbaceous vegetation. Utilization is the proportion of the current year's forage production that is consumed or destroyed by grazing animals. It is a very informative measure with direct implications for management. Utilization measures can be used to evaluate the impact of grazing animals on vegetation, and so it provides information about the intensity of use. We also can use this information to determine spatial patterns of use by grazing animals, and so it provides information about the grazing distribution. Utilization measurements are commonly used to guide management decisions and planning. Utilization is usually calculated by determining the weight of the biomass that has been removed and calculating a proportion relative to the total production from throughout the growing season. Let's look at an example where we have the growing season occurs between April to September. We can see, if you examine the row with the monthly production estimates, that growth increases as we go through the growing season and peaking in July, but we still have substantial growth that occurs in August and September. We can see the cumulative production over time in this table. Now, let's assume that we use this area for grazing and that the animals are put on at the beginning of the growing season or shortly after the growing season begins, and this area is grazed until July. If we want to estimate the amount of utilization when the animals are removed in July, what we would do is estimate the average amount of weight that has been removed by the animals. Utilization is calculated as the proportion of the weight removed relative to the total annual production. Since the growing season continues through September, we would need to evaluate total peak standing crop in September so that we could evaluate utilization, and that would be 33%, or 100 divided by 300 grams times 100 for 33% utilization. Now, it would be a different situation if we took our measurements of production in July. If that were the case, we would estimate the standing crop that had been produced to that point in the season at 200 grams, and if we calculated utilization based on those 200 grams, we would get an estimate of 50% utilization. Now, this is actually called relative use. Relative use is the proportion of the forage that is produced to date that has been consumed or destroyed by the grazing animals. So it's important to make the distinction between utilization and relative use. Relative use usually estimates a greater amount of use than utilization because it does not take into consideration the total amount of biomass that is produced throughout the growing season. It's important to remember that relative use is not the same thing as utilization. When we are sampling, we usually use a selective sampling approach with utilization. So rather than randomly choosing our sites, we are very specific and particular about where we do our sampling. Most often this is done through the use of key areas or critical areas. A key area is a sampling site that is specifically selected because of its location, use, or a value, the value of a monitoring site specific to grazing. Key areas are assumed to be representative of the larger management unit, both in terms of the mix of species that grow there, as well as the way that the site responds to management. Critical areas are different in that these are areas that receive some type of special consideration from a management perspective because of inherent site factors. Critical areas may include riparian areas or sites that support known populations of a plant species of concern, among other things. We also need to make decisions on whether we're going to estimate utilization based on key species or total forage. Utilization can be measured on the total forage vegetation as a whole, but very often we focus on key species. Key species are those forage species whose use serves as an indicator of the degree to which the unit and associated species are also used. We commonly focus our management or our measurement efforts on selected key species because they are indicators of the response of the entire unit to management. There are a number of ways that we can measure utilization, and we're going to focus on the two main types, which are direct comparisons as well as estimation methods. With direct comparisons, we basically want to compare grazed and ungrazed areas. And this is a direct comparison because we harvest the standing crop in both grazed and ungrazed areas. We commonly use cages or sometimes exclosures in order to protect areas from grazing so that we can have ungrazed areas for comparison. And you can see in the photographs here a cage that is being very well secured to the ground, and usually cages are used for short-term evaluations of utilization on the order of weeks to perhaps as long as a month. If we do want to evaluate utilization over a longer term, that's when more often we would use an exclosure. The reason for this is that cages can have an impact on growth because the microclimate inside the cage is slightly different than outside of the cage. So let's take a look at an example of how this is done. With cages, we often use either paired plots or unpaired plots. We're going to examine paired plots first. With paired plots, when you're getting ready to start your observations or to set up the exclosure of grazing, you locate pairs of plots that are similar in the amount and the mixture of plants that are in each one of the plots. And so you have to take some time locating these plots. It's also important that they're a certain distance from each other so that they don't impact each other. But here we see another pair of plots that is relatively similar. We then randomly assign one of the plots in a pair to be caged, and the other one is left open so that it is exposed to grazing. The cages are left in place while the growing season and the grazing season continue, and when we are ready to evaluate utilization, the cages are removed, and we measure the amount of production in the caged plots as well as in the uncaged plots. So what we see here is in this plot that was caged, we have 200 grams total production compared to the grazed plot in this pair is 140 grams. And in this case, we had 180 grams production in the caged plot compared to 150 grams in the other portion of that pair. If we then were to analyze these data, we do this on a pair-by-pair basis, first determining the amount of material that was removed by comparing what was in the grazed plot of the pair to the ungrazed, and we do that for each one of the pairs. We then determine the average difference. So for the first pair, there was 60 grams that was removed, is the difference between them. The second pair was 30 grams. In this case, the average difference is 45 grams. And the total annual production is the average of the two caged plots, or all of the caged plots. We would normally have more than a sample size of 2 pairs. And we calculate utilization as the difference or the proportion of 45 grams divided by 190 grams equals 24% utilization. Now, if we were to look at using cages but with unpaired plots, when this is done, the cages are laid out without taking time to find a location for its pair, its grazed plot that is paired with it. There's no pairing that is involved. And so in this case, this grazed plot was located in an area that wasn't necessarily related at all to the caged plot. The calculation is slightly different because there are no pairs. We simply calculate an average biomass from the caged plots and an average biomass from the uncaged plots. And then we calculate utilization by dividing the amount of biomass that was removed by the total amount produced. In this case, the estimate of utilization is 31.5%. The advantage of pairing is that by having similarity between the members of the pair, you can estimate utilization using fewer samples. And reduced samples means usually less time and money involved in the sampling, setting it up, as well as estimating. Now we're going to consider a couple of estimation methods. In these estimation methods, they generally rely on knowledge of some sort of a relationship between utilization and another variable or variables. With the height-weight method, we need to determine the height and weight of ungrazed plants. And it's important to consider how biomass is distributed in grass plants. Usually, grass plants, the biomass of a grass plant is concentrated near the bottom of the plant. And so what we see in this diagram here is a line showing that if we removed this amount of the grass, 25% of the weight has been removed and 75% of the weight remains. Now, obviously, more than 25% of the height of the plant has been removed. And so in order to do the height-weight method, we have to develop a regression relationship, or sometimes we will iteratively measure the height and of plants that are ungrazed, and then determine the proportion of the weight in those ungrazed plants as sections or segments of that plant. And we develop usually a curve. Sometimes we can develop tables that help us to relate this information about the height of grazed plants to the amount of weight removed. So for example, you can see in this set of curves that was developed for blue grama, if we had a plant that was 28 inches tall and half of it is grazed, it is grazed down to 14 inches, we've only removed approximately 25% of its weight, so 25% utilization. On the same plant, if it had been grazed to a 7-inch height, that would still represent only approximately 40% utilization, and 60% of its weight would be remaining. We develop these kinds of relationships and then can put the information either into some useful tools, such as a utilization gauge, that are utilization gauges produced by the Forest Service are very handy references to use out in the field, or we can develop conversion tables so that if you measure the height of ungrazed plants and the height of the grazed plants, you can calculate the amount of utilization from those plants. So let's look at a little example of how this might be done if we walked a transect and then on every third step decided we would look at the plant that was closest to our foot. We would first of all characterize whether or not it had been grazed or ungrazed and measure the height of that plant. So in this case, this plant is ungrazed and it was 24 inches tall. At the next one, it's a grazed plant, it's been grazed to 4 inches. The next one here was grazed and it is 18 inches tall. The next plant was also grazed and is 10 inches tall. And finally, this last plant is 22 inches tall and was ungrazed. The way we would analyze these data, and again, this is a very small data set with only 5 plants, we can see that we come up with an average height of the ungrazed plant, and based on that, we would use one of our either a conversion table or a gauge or a curve, and based on the ungrazed height, the average ungrazed height, we know that a plant that has been grazed to 4 inches shows 50% removal of its biomass. The average utilization then would be the sum of these divided by the number of plants that were observed, or 16% utilization. Now another approach that we use that relies on estimation also uses height, but instead of having to measure plants, we use photo guides that have been developed for different species. In this image here, we see photo guides for switchgrass, showing what an average switchgrass plant would look like if it was ungrazed at 0%, slightly grazed at 10%, moderately grazed at 30% utilization, etc. Using photo guides, we classify plants according to whether they fit into one of 6 different classes, so 0, 10, 30, 50, 70, or 90% grazed. Again, we would walk a transect and tally all of the plants in each of the grazed classes. We then weight them by the midpoint of that class and then calculate an average utilization. So again, let's see what happens when we walk our plant, our transect, and examine the amount of use on each plant. In this case, remember, we're just comparing them to photo guides and looking at the amount of production, or excuse me, not the amount of production, but comparing them to see which class they would fall into. And they were classified. We had 2 plants that were ungrazed. We also have 1 plant that was classified as slightly grazed, 1 that was moderately grazed at 30%, and then one that was fully grazed at 50%. This would calculate out on a sample size of 5 to 18% utilization overall. Another method that's used in some situations is the grazed plant method. This is an easy method to employ that uses a rapid survey, usually of 100 plants, and in this case, instead of trying to determine the amount of grazing that has been done, we simply rate plants as being either grazed or ungrazed. One of the major assumptions is that usually the stocking is fairly light and that plants have not been regrazed. We calculate the percent of plants that are grazed, and we also need to have a regression relationship developed that has been determined based on another method of measuring utilization. So you can't use just grazed versus ungrazed to determine utilization itself. You have to actually determine the amount of utilization on a site and relate to that the number of plants or the percentage of plants that are usually grazed. In this case, what we see here is a regression equation or a regression that has been developed, and this is showing that if you have 36% of the plants that are ungrazed, meaning that 64% of the plants have been grazed, that represents 50% use. If you had 40% of the plants ungrazed and 60% grazed, then you would expect to see slightly less utilization, about 45% utilization. So let's see how this works once again with this step point transect. Again, each of the plants at the pace is identified, but whether it's just been grazed or not grazed. So it's a very simple yes-no decision, grazed or ungrazed. And then if we look at the way these data would be used, we tally the grazed plants and the ungrazed plants. We determine the percent that are grazed, the percent that are ungrazed, and then based on that regression equation, that relationship that was determined previously, we know that if you have 40% ungrazed plants, that equals 45% utilization. Another estimation method is ocular estimation, and this is a visual estimation of utilization. It's quite similar to the estimation methods that we use to determine production, except we're trying to estimate something that has been removed. It requires an iterative training process in which we estimate the percent of the weight that has been removed, and then we have to verify this by clipping in on a plant that has not been grazed. We do this repeatedly. We estimate, and then we clip and weigh. We estimate and clip and weigh, and we repeat this until the percent that has been removed can be estimated with the desired accuracy. Then when we go to sample, we estimate on a plant or quadrat basis. The last method that we're going to consider is a visual rating method. This is Usually we rate the use of an area on a relative scale. And so it's good for large scale surveys or for mapping use zones. This is done by observing indicators of the relative amount of use on high value and low value forage plants, and then using some guides or tables, we rate the amount of use at specific locations, and we can then use this as a kind of a rough scale guide of utilization, and again can be used to map use zones. So if we look at this diagram of a hypothetical management unit that has some variation in that there's a single water point down here, and we have a mesa up here where there's going to be some steep slopes that make it difficult for animals to access, and then use the visual rating system, we could develop a use zone map such as this, where certain areas, as we would expect near the water point, would have more severe use, very heavy use, and then lighter use as we move away from that because of the inaccessibility due to the terrain. We find that we have none to very slight use at the mesa top. So in conclusion, utilization measures are used to inform management decisions, and utilization can be very difficult to measure because we're trying to estimate something that has been removed. There are several reliable methods that do work well when they are applied consistently and correctly.